Now to Iraq. The UN has released the shocking casualty figures in Iraq during the month of July. According to United Nations mission in Iraq, 1,057 Iraqis were killed and another 2,326 were wounded. This classifies July as the deadliest month since 2008. Now, bombings have ripped through crowded cafes and mowed down worshippers at mosques throughout the month last month. Militants also carried out brazen assaults on 2 prisons. And Georgi Boustin, the acting special representative of the UN Secretary General for Iraq, stated that the impact of violence on civilians remains disturbingly high, and he urged political leaders to take immediate actions to stop the senseless bloodshed. Iraqi authorities believe the local offshoot of al-Qaeda and other Sunni-backed fighter groups are responsible for much of the violence. According to the UN, more than twice as many civilians were killed in Iraq during the first 6 months, just 6 months of 2013, as were killed over the same period in Afghanistan. Joining us to discuss this now is Phyllis Bennis, the director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies in D.C. Phyllis, thank you for joining us. Why are these numbers so shockingly high again, in your opinion, and why do we not talk about this more than we are right now?
You know, I think the reason we don't talk about it is because this level of violence is very much rooted in the origins of the U.S. war in in Iraq. What that means, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, it imposed a political system that was grounded in the creation of sectarian-based political parties that had never existed before in Iraq, that had no history in Iraq. So there were Sunni parties and Shia parties and Kurdish parties that were designed to divide people. Now, any occupying army knows that that's one of the best ways to control people is to divide them. So the U.S. did it by sect. The violence began to explode. And in the period around 2006 and 2007 into 2008, we saw this massively sectarian war that was being waged in Iraq. Then it faded over in recent years, and now it's resumed with a terrible vengeance. Part of that is because new weapons have been made available coming in from among other places, from Libya, the aftermath of the U.S.-NATO overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya that left the borders wide open and weapons pouring out to all parts of the region. Part of it is the region-wide crises that we're seeing now in Egypt. We're seeing the overthrow of the Islamist government and resulting instability, particularly in Syria, where we're seeing an increasingly sectarian nature of this regional war that's being fought out in Syria. So all of these are playing a role in Iraq, where the social fabric had been shredded by the years of war.
And, you know, whether it was intentional or not, you said the U.S. used sectarian lines to divide the people. A lot of people suggest that the government, the Shia-led government, is doing that very same thing still today, as you're referencing. And, you know, when we talk about what's happening in Iraq, which we don't do so often, it's confusing to really understand where there's an opportunity to try and reconcile what's happening so Iraq doesn't become another civil war. You've pointed to many parts of the world in the region, particular where, for example, militants in Iraq are involved in Syria and vice versa. Some are even suggesting
the border is a transit point for weapons, for fighters. The war in Syria is making everything worse in the region, and particularly Iraq, which is right next door. This explosion of violence is very much linked to what's going on in Iraq and throughout the region. It's a hard question to answer. What could we be doing?
Right.
The U.S. was forced to withdraw all the troops, not only the combat troops, which had not been President Obama's initial plan, because of the refusal of the Iraqi parliament to grant permanent immunity for all U.S. soldiers who remained against any charges of war crimes. And of course, no president is going to allow soldiers to serve if they're not immune, because they know there will be war crimes. And in that context, with all the soldiers out and all the Pentagon-paid contractors or mercenaries out, only a small number, about 12,000 or so, State Department-paid contractors are now in Iraq that are linked to the United States government. So we don't have a lot of military engagement. What we do have is a long-standing relationship of sending weapons, sending planes, sending bullets, sending bombs, which we could stop doing that with this government, and try and re-engage in something that's not going to be very easy. Who do you send money to for reconstruction when the government we know is responsible for many of these terrible attacks, for much of this sectarianism? There's no easy answer to that.
And Phyllis, obviously, you know, the U.S. is also sending weapons to other countries, Egypt included, and it all does come together as you're making those connections for us. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to leave you with this tweet and give you a quick opportunity to respond. Mahdi Hassan from the Huffington Post in the UK says, Iraq's slide into endemic violence has been obscured. In July so far, deaths in Iraq have exceeded those in Syria, referring to a Guardian article. Do you think that it matters, does it matter what the U.S. does in Syria, what the U.S. does in Egypt as it pertains to Iraq? Because it seems like the U.S. is almost pretending as though what's happening in Iraq is in fact not happening.
I think the U.S. government would love to think that the war in Iraq is over and everything is fine. We created a democracy, now we've left it and we're moving on. That's not the case. Wars have consequences, and the illegal invasion of Iraq, the occupation of Iraq, after years of illegal sanctions, have had a huge impact on that society, and we owe an enormous debt of reparations, of compensation. How to do that is not answered by sending more weapons to the current government.
Right.
How to do it is still a challenge, and we haven't figured out a good answer. Unfortunately, our government doesn't even seem to be interested in asking the question.
Right. Well, I appreciate you answering our questions and in provoking those questions. Hopefully you'll join us again very soon. Thanks, Phyllis.
I look forward to it. Thanks.